This is one of my favorite theories, and it comes from a lady named Tara Brach. It's all about vulnerability, and I could go all Brene Brown if you know what I'm talking about right now. And if you don't know her, Brene Brown, she talks a lot about vulnerability. But vulnerability is scary because we're in danger or could be in danger when we're exposed. Well, you're talking to the wrong person because I'm very transparent about everything. But the idea is we went on to another planet. We might need to put a spacesuit on to protect our vulnerabilities. So one of the ideas that I talk about in my class is this quote from Freud: the first act of anxiety or experience of anxiety is the act of birth. And why is that? Well, we're all safe and comfy in the womb. It's kind of like the Matrix. All of our needs are cared for. We're connected literally to our mother. And then in the time of birth, we're disconnected. And not only are we disconnected, we're thrown out into this big, scary world where we become vulnerable. And so now we might need to devise a way to protect our vulnerability. And that's where the spacesuit comes in. So on the next slide, it's just an audio recording, but you're going to hear Tara Brach talk about this vulnerability and the spacesuit strategy.
The understanding of Buddhism and Western psychology in an existential way is that whenever we incarnate, there's a sense of a self in here and a world out there. There's some sense of separation. And so that in an evolutionary way, we're designed to identify as a self, identify as some separate entity, and then try to control our environment to make it. Science has discovered that we wake up 10 times a night to scan our environment to make sure there's nothing wrong. And then we fall asleep, and unless we have a sleep disorder, actually we don't remember that. But it's our evolutionary advantage to be vigilant. Creatures have to be vigilant, and there's an undercurrent of something is either wrong or could go wrong in any moment. Now that doesn't necessarily translate to emotional suffering. Many mammals have emotions that are wired into them, many of the same emotions that we have. So it becomes interesting to sense, what is it that turns our rigging to have emotions into suffering? And in humans, what we have is a much more highly developed process of thinking so that we can remember things from the past and plan in the future, unlike other creatures that we know about. And what this means is that when there's wounding, when there's some pain that we encountered, we have more access, more ability to dredge it up. We're motivated to bring it up so we don't have the experience again, and there's more of a compulsion to plan to avoid problems in the future. So that sense of something's wrong and the different ways that's expressed emotionally, whether it's shame or fear or anger, actually becomes a sustained state of mind. And our sense of who we are gets hitched to it. Most often what we're hitched to is the sense not only that something's wrong, but that something's wrong with me. And there's, in this culture, a lot that exacerbates that. We don't have much of a sense of natural belonging in our culture, and there's not a sense of real tribe or close community. So we each are given these standards that we have to meet in order to be okay, to be acceptable, to be lovable. And so we feel a sense of having to prove ourselves, to be special, to look a certain way, to act a certain way. And under that, the message is that our natural way of being is not okay. Now, this trance of not okay, of unworthiness, varies depending on our families and our genetics. When in a family situation we experience extreme kind of abuse or physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional abuse, then the wounding and the remembering and the obsessive thinking ahead are much more intense. But even when the wounding is not so obvious, our sense of not mattering, our sense of being invisible or not okay, can be quite deep. I know in one story I heard, a family was at a restaurant, and parents and young boy, and they were ordering their food, and the parents made their order, and then the child said, well, I'll have hot dogs, French fries, and a Coke. At which point his dad said, oh, no, you won't. You'll have meatloaf and mashed potatoes and carrots. And the waitress just looked at the little boy and said, so, hon, what do you want on that hot dog? The family were kind of stunned. They just sat there. She left, and he looked at his parents, and he said, she thinks I'm real. When we are not paid attention to in a way we need, when we're not seen, when what matters to us isn't taken into account, when we're not loved the way we need to feel loved, there's a deep conclusion that we make, that I'm not lovable, that I don't matter, that I'm not worthwhile. And those raw feelings often are so painful to feel that we then organize ourselves around these strategies to feel better, to not have to feel that core sense of fear, I'll be rejected, I'll be alone, of hurt, of shame. So what happens is we do a cover-up. We do what we can to cover up the vulnerability, what I sometimes call the unlived life, the tangles and the wounds that are too painful to just feel. And I sometimes imagine it like we come onto this earth, this difficult atmosphere, and we develop a spacesuit of strategies to navigate our environment, to win approval, to win love, to cover over the insecurity. And we each have a set of strategies. We each have a spacesuit, kind of a mask that we present. For some, it's striving and accomplishing and trying to prove ourselves through our doings. There's also ways that we try to make ourselves invisible, a cloak of invisibility. And then, of course, for many, there's some ways of deceiving or exaggerating or pretending that our experience is different than it is. And for many in this culture, addictive behaviors to kind of cover over that raw vulnerability, getting fixated and addicted to sex or gambling, to drugs, to caffeine, to being entertained. But the most basic spacesuit strategy that we use that keeps us locked in a sense of deficiency is judgment. We blame others, resent others, and then in the most core way, we're at war with ourselves. And it's a spacesuit strategy. We're trying to fix ourselves, trying to be a better person, trying to get away from that raw, powerless feeling of not okay. So in the trance of unworthiness, we develop these coverings, these strategies, and we get identified with them. They become what most tells us who we are. One of the stories in the Buddhist world that has drawn a lot of attention is of a old temple in the ancient capital of Sukhothai in Thailand, where there's this enormous clay Buddha that's been repainted and cared for over the centuries. Not considered a particularly beautiful statue of a Buddha, but revered because it had survived all these storms and invasions and so on. But in recent years, there was this stretch of hot and dry weather, and the statue began to crack, and one of the cracks was big enough that a curious monk took a flashlight and looked inside to see if he could understand the infrastructure, what was inside the statue, and what shined back at him was the flash of gold. And he and the other monks looked into some of the other cracks, and they discovered that inside the statue was one of the largest, most luminous gold images of the Buddha ever created in Southeast Asia. And what's interesting to me is that the monks believed that this statue had been covered with plaster and clay to protect it from harm during periods of conflict and unrest. It's kind of like the spacesuit, that in a similar way, we humans, when we encounter difficulty, and we all do, we cover over our innate purity with these strategies, these ways of protecting and defending and proving. And we do it so much so that we forget our essential nature. We think we're the spacesuit, and we forget who's looking through.